The Pact under glass. The planet rotated slowly beneath the viewport, all shadow and flame-tinted clouds in the pre-dawn arc. Trellin Voss stood in silence, hands folded behind his dorsal humps, the soft glow of data panes blinking in the dark viewing chamber. The chamber was sealed, and the only sound came from the steady rhythm of coolant cycling through the racks of sensor processors. In orbit, there was no sunrise, only orbital drift. But on the surface, the Xenos were stirring. Sarathel Station had been in operation for nearly 20 planetary circuits. Its staff were all Elyri, rotating shifts of field analysts, linguists, system engineers, each assigned a limited term to reduce contamination risk and prevent pattern fixation. That was the theory, anyway. Trellin had served here longer than permitted. He told himself it was necessary, that he was merely confirming patterns, that the Xenos below required a longer window of observation. But his daily logs had long since blurred into habit, and his private reflections now trailed into silence. Subject populations remain behaviorally consistent, he said aloud, logging his report. Surface settlements show negligible technological progression. Power sources are hydroelectric, fuel combustion minimal. Seasonal migrations continue along historic vector paths. His gaze drifted toward a cluster of structures nestled along a river bend, what the field index labeled as K281, the largest settlement on the planet and apparent capital. The buildings appeared designed more for function than form. Steel-reinforced timber, poured earthcrete foundations, photovoltaic panels daisy-chained across rooftops like clustered lichen, micro-hydro generators at the river's bend. The visual signature was consistent with low-emission, self-contained habitation, efficient, modest, and dated. To the untrained eye, it was late technological age, pre-interstellar spaceflight, and post-electric. Stagnant. But Trellin was trained, and he didn't believe in stasis. Cultural evolution appears unusually constrained, he said. His finger hesitated above the transmit glyph. No signals traced beyond planetary gravity well. No active comm structures above high atmo. No response to suborbital provocation pulses. As before. He tapped the log closed and stepped back from the display. Beneath the veneer of detachment, something itched. The Elyri viewed non-interference as sacred. Their treaties were clear. Do not touch. Do not guide. Do not name. Observation only. And yet, 20 circuits. And nothing about the Xenos on this world added up. He had studied comparative xenosociology, studied entire historical civilizations in decline, seen the data on what happens when populations collapsed or mutated under isolation. The curve was always erratic, always noisy. But here, K281 had held perfect population variance within 3% standard deviation for 2 decades. It wasn't natural. Trellin stepped into the low-gravity corridor connecting to the analysis bay. The magnetic pull of the floor hummed through his limbs, and the pulse-adjusted lighting dimmed as he moved. At his station, secondary feeds filtered in: thermal imaging, language patterns, commerce trends, atmospheric residue analysis. He skimmed the full data from the beginning of the latest circuit. The same public rituals, the same symbolic flood-control drama, even the same arguments between regional leaders, scripted like an opera, down to the placement of observers in the crowd. A mimicry. Or something more. From the adjoining bay, a voice filtered through the intercom. "Trellin, you're over your cycle limit again." It was Valreth Dawn, senior systems behaviorist, formal, cautious, loyal to treaty over truth. "I had reports to finalize," Trellin replied. You had them finalized 6 rotations ago. Trellin didn't answer. He didn't need to. Valreth's tone shifted slightly. You're still tracking the K281 cluster, aren't you? A statement, not a question. Trellin leaned forward, zooming in on a satellite's passive feed. Below, a group of Xenos began to gather near a low ridge. Bright fabric waved in the wind. Children danced around an array of carved stones. A ritual, again. Yes, he said, still tracking. Valreth paused. Then, you're starting to see things that aren't there. After a moment, Valreth entered the bay and stepped up beside him, arms crossed. No signal transmissions, no interstellar registry, no orbital infrastructure beyond weather monitoring, standard renewable tech. They're a pre-expansion culture optimized for longevity. Quiet and local. Yes. But optimized how? Trellin pressed. Valreth frowned. Just enough technology to maintain stability. No vertical architecture. No machine cognition. Minimalist automated agriculture. They've stabilized local industry around renewables. Culturally unremarkable. Philosophically isolated. Trellin said nothing. He watched a group gather in the central square. Barter, exchange, ritual nods. Faces rotated every few days. Tasks rotated weekly. A pattern with no deviation. A system with no noise. A culture designed not to grow, but to hold still. He wasn't sure why it unsettled him. File the review, Trellin said at last. No non-interference treaty violations. No observed advancement. Valreth raised an eyebrow. You'll report this yourself. I will. As the door hissed closed behind Valreth, Trellin remained at the view screen. Below, the colony breathed on, quiet, composed, as if waiting for someone to finally see it. He stayed there long after the next shift began. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm by the time Farah Benton climbed the Riverstone platform and gave the signal. She wore a high-collared gray coat, wax-treated for the weather, with copper fastenings that caught the low light of the beacon fires. Her breath fogged slightly in the cool air as she lifted her voice, clear, resonant, and perfectly paced. Below, a crowd of colonists gathered in the open plaza, ringed by weathered concrete and steel. To an orbiting observer, it might resemble a post-industrial township, mid-century Terran. Not primitive, but not particularly advanced either. The vehicles parked under the overhangs were electric. The lighting was solar-fed. Water turbines hummed faintly beyond the settlement's eastern slope, just visible through the low-hanging mist. But here, now, in the center of the square, all of that receded behind the ritual. Children carried stylized glyphs drawn on metal sheeting, symbols from a language no one spoke, carefully designed to imply oral tradition. Adults stood in practiced formation, responding to Farah's declarations with rhythmic affirmations. Colored smoke drifted upward from the copper-lined brazier. It was an illusion, a refinement of truth. Behind the platform, Marin Callis stood beneath the eave of the council hall. Tall, dark-haired, and dressed in slate-blue utility gear, he observed without speaking. His posture was easy but deliberate, hands resting behind his back, gaze steady. He was no mystic. He was the colony's senior coordinator. At his side, Tomas Varani adjusted a small control pad mounted on the wall of the hall. Its readout was dimmed, standard anti-surveillance protocol, but the diagnostics told him what he needed. The hydropower relay was operating at safe thermal variance. The comm buffers were clean. The ambient signal noise was right where it needed to be. "Hydro's holding," Tomas murmured. "No power spikes. They'll read us as manual coordinated." Marin gave a slight nod. "Any sign of orbital sweep lag?" "None. Their sensors are still running a 2-pass cycle." We've got a clean hour." Down in the plaza, Nolan Merrick emerged from the west gate wearing a heavy poncho and old-fashioned radio headset. A single-barrel kinetic rifle rested on his shoulder, not loaded, but visibly functional. Part of the show. He made a circuit of the plaza perimeter, nodding silently to others in costume. This version of Kinlar's Reach, the one the observers believed, was slow-growing, inward-looking, barely brushing against space-capable thresholds. A backwater, barely worth documentation. That was the goal. On a ridge overlooking the settlement, Ari Mendoza adjusted a signal scrubber concealed beneath a weather balloon anchor. Her fingers were cold, the rain cutting down in curtains now, but the instrumentation held steady. The acoustic profile of the ritual matched prior years within a 2.3% deviation. It was good enough. Down below, Farah's voice rose in its final arc. "In the cycle of rivers and stone, we endure. Rooted, unyielding, whole." The response came, soft but firm. "Whole." As the crowd dispersed, smoke curling behind them into the gray sky, Marin stepped forward from the eave. Farah met him at the edge of the dais, tugging her gloves off one finger at a time. "Timing was tight," Marin said. "Nice work." "We got lucky," Farah replied. "The kids were late on the middle sequence." They're always late," came Tomas's voice as he approached, tapping residual mist from his control slate. "But no anomalies on sweep. Sound levels stayed within range. Visuals looked suitably civic without being too choreographed." Ari joined them, tucking her hood back. Her curls were soaked, and she didn't bother trying to fix them. "Peak and burn was low. If they noticed anything unusual, it'll register as thermal drag from the smoke." "Good," Marin said. His voice carried a quiet gravity. "Let's keep it that way." They all stood there for a moment, rain tapping on metal and fabric, breath turning to vapor in the cold. Then Nolan arrived, poncho dripping, rifles slung loose. "I had eyes on the ridge during the whole performance," he said. "No activity, no drones. Their silence is starting to feel like a bluff." Marin met his gaze. Or a test. "You think they're waiting to see if we slip?" "I think they're wondering what we'll do if we realize they've slipped." That shut down the conversation. Marin turned toward the council hall. "Playback goes into review tonight. Tomas, bring the acoustic overlay. Ari, prep a pattern offset for the next solstice cycle." Then he paused. Farah was still standing at the base of the platform, head tilted slightly, eyes on the overcast sky. "How long do we keep this up?" she asked. Not accusing, just tired. Marin glanced over his shoulder. "We all knew we'd be out here without help from the home systems. No long-range comm network, no regular resupply. We might not have a visit from the Commonwealth for another 20 years, even assuming things haven't changed back there. You know as well as I do that a lot of anti-expansion factions were gaining political traction when we left." Neither of them said anything for a moment as his words lingered between them. "So, as long as they keep watching," he finally said, and then he walked back inside. The playback room smelled faintly of solder and rain-damp wood. It was built into the rear of the old prefab council structure, lined with mineral insulation panels and crammed with terminals salvaged from their original landing craft. Everything inside hummed with repurposed life, barely modern and just enough to fool an alien telemetry pass. Tomas Varani stood at the central console, cycling through drone-filtered footage of the ritual. He'd already color-balanced the firelight, cropped the flare from Ari's beacon, and muted the high-band buzz from a bad cable in Quadrant 3. It's not exactly Shakespeare," he muttered, "but I think the sky gods bought the act." On the far side of the room, Farah Benton sipped from a steaming mug and raised an eyebrow. "If the sky gods are still watching, I'm beginning to think they got bored and wandered off to find a more dysfunctional species." "Now, where would they find that within 1,000 light years?" "Touché." The screen paused in a wide shot of Kinlar's reach, rain glistening on the rooftops, the banner smoke curling upward. The crowd dispersed just enough to show apparent spontaneity. It was, objectively, perfect. And still, it left a bad taste in Marin Callis's mouth. He stood at the end of the conference table, hands folded, sleeves rolled up to the elbows. The lighting cast deep shadows under his eyes. He hadn't slept well, and it showed. "They're still up there," he said, voice low but firm. "No signal variance, no decay in the orbital relay patterns. They haven't left." Tomas leaned against the console. "You sure they're not just parked? I mean, if they wanted to see us stagnate, we've delivered a masterclass." "We're not stagnating," Farah said. "We're dancing in place." Ari Mendoza entered carrying a data tablet under one arm, her expression pinched. "They pinged us," she said, 47 minutes after the ceremony." Marin sat up. "Show me." She tossed the tablet onto the table. "Buried in the low-frequency noise band. Carrier disguised as harmonic interference. Same trick they've used before." He skimmed the waveform. It looked like nothing to the untrained eye, but Ari's filter had stripped the layers clean. Pulses, rhythmic, deliberate. "They're still measuring," Marin said quietly. "Still logging behavioral drift." "And we're still passing," Tomas added. "Which makes me wonder, what happens if we fail one?" Farah looked toward the shuttered window, where mist still clung to the glass in streaks. "Depends what they think we are." There was a long pause. Then Marin stood and crossed to the screen. The footage looped one more time. The firelight, the movements, the symbolic offerings. Manufactured ritual. "How long," he asked, not looking at them, "before we stop knowing which parts of us are real?" Ari sank into a chair. "I stopped knowing 5 years ago." Tomas gave a small, rueful laugh. "You always say that." "Because it's always true." Nolan Merrick arrived late, boots wet, rifle slung across his back. He peeled off his coat and tossed it onto a hook. "You're all still talking about the performance." "We're always talking about the performance," said Farah, deadpan. He dropped into the nearest seat. "Well, I've got a hot take. Maybe next time we just build a bonfire shaped like a middle finger and see what happens." "Oh, that one's already in the backup rotation," Ari said dryly. "Page 4 of the diplomatic playbook." The laughter this time was real, but brief. Then Marin turned back to them, expression sharp again. "Start prepping the mid-year festival. Less symmetry this time. Make the rituals more erratic. Shift the performance rotations. Ari, write in a civic conflict arc. Tomas, bake in a half-point power dropout during the finale. If they're still watching, they'll expect degradation." "And if they're not?" Nolan asked. "Then we're wasting a lot of creativity on empty space," Marin said. "But I'd rather over-prepare for silence than underestimate a gaze." They nodded, one by one. Agreement without comfort. Outside, the clouds began to break. Just a little. Trellin Voss had learned, early in his training, to trust statistical deviation over instinct. Instinct, after all, could be shaped by expectation. Data could not. Or so he had believed. Now, seated in the curved gloom of Archive Bay 3, staring at a decade-long cycle of behavioral heat maps, Trellin felt the slow, pricking edge of unease. A tension like a filament pulled taut beneath his skin. He dragged a gloved finger across the displayed timeline. Seasonal festivals, agricultural patterns, demographic shifts, migration patterns in outlying settlements, all mapped in slow loops and colored gradients, each node pinged against predictive curves. And every time he isolated a fluctuation, every time the model strayed beyond a 5% margin, it corrected itself the following year. Not gradually, not organically, cleanly, precisely. That didn't happen in open ecosystems. Trellin shifted forward, angling the holographic projection lens and adjusting the playback speed. The plaza in the Xeno settlement K281 appeared in motion, as if viewed through time itself. Rainfall, festival structures, citizen formations. The shapes flowed, bent, and reformed again. At first, he thought it was compression artifacting. Then, he realized it was choreography. He froze the frame. 2 children, barely visible, exchanging bundles of cloth at the market fringe. Same movement, same angle, exactly 6 years apart. That was not cultural echo. That was design. Trellin? The voice came through the wall plate. Valrith Dawn again, his tone clipped, brittle with formality. You've exceeded independent observation protocols. Tertiary archives are off limits without committee oversight. I'm not altering anything, Trellin replied. Just reviewing data. A pause. Then, you've been reviewing for 3 full rotations. Trellin rubbed at the ridge between his eyes, feeling the familiar pulse of tension beneath his temples. The K281 cluster displays artificial temporal recursion, festival structure, infrastructure repair patterns, demographic variances. They're looping. Silence on the other end. Then Valreth's voice returned, more measured now. We've seen cultural recursion before. Post-catastrophe societies sometimes recreate tradition to preserve continuity. And a collapse would certainly explain the sparse population. They don't do it this cleanly, Trellin said, and not this subtly. These aren't rewritings. They're repetitions, with only slight, deliberately introduced imperfections. Another silence. Then, you think they know. I think, Trellin said slowly, maybe they've always known. He closed the archive and leaned back in his chair. The faint hum of the environmental filters filled the silence, accompanied by the soft creak of flex metal beneath him. They're performing, he said aloud, more to himself now. Not for each other. For us? Across the station, the central orbiter sent out its standard low-frequency ping. Another automatic telemetry sweep of the surface, indistinguishable from ambient planetary noise. An action taken irregularly, but periodically, and theoretically unnoticed for decades. But now, it felt more like a question. And the Xenos, Trellin suspected, were answering with a lie built from perfect truths. He absent-mindedly turned his access keycard end over end in his hand. If the Xenos already knew, then the non-interference accords might have already been breached. It was time to look deeper. The Council archive was underground, not because of secrecy, but because Kinlar's reach had always built downward, rooted, anchored. It was one of the colony's oldest decisions. If someone was watching, let them think they were too cautious, too bound to the earth to reach for the stars. Marin Callis stood before a narrow projection screen, arms folded, watching an earlier version of himself deliver a speech he no longer remembered. It was solstice, year 8. The firelight danced in old colors. His voice was steady, but the cadence was wrong. Too confident, too sincere. God, I was an idiot, he muttered. Ari Mendoza, seated cross-legged on the edge of a nearby storage crate, grinned into her tablet. You were charismatic, which is worse. Farrah Benton leaned over the back of her chair and tapped a control node, fast-forwarding the video until the ceremonial torch flickered against a backdrop of cloth-painted symbols. The crowd in the footage cheered at the right moment. The right number of children danced. Even the smoke moved predictably. It's all too tight, Farrah said. We've smoothed ourselves into a myth. That's what we wanted, Ari replied. We are the myth. Marin turned from the screen. No, we're playing the myth. We can't afford to forget that. The silence that followed had the worn-out shape of an old debate. They'd had this conversation before. 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. After the last review of the Equinox ritual. After the last quiet echo from orbit. Tomas Varani stepped in from the corridor, brushing dust off his sleeves. Nolan's prepping the civic dispute arc. I talked to him this morning. He's ready to start raising hell about grain allotments next cycle. Farah gave a dry smile. He's wanted an excuse for that for years. Then it'll come off natural, Tomas said, dropping a printout on the table. No power cuts this time, like we agreed. Just tonal drift. Messier formations, civil disagreements. Right. We're trying to show where, Marin said, not collapse. Ari nodded. One of the kids drew a circuit diagram in her school journal last week. I made her add stick figures and call it a family tree. Farah raised an eyebrow. Overcorrecting a bit. She labeled the power cells as antis. Marin let out a quiet breath, half exasperation, half amusement. We're going to actually forget who we are if we keep pretending we've forgotten. Isn't that the game? Tomas asked. We play it, losing ourselves until they lose interest. That was the game, Ari said. Now it feels like they're leaning in. The others looked up. She brought up her tablet and flicked a waveform onto the central screen. I got another surface echo. Same noise band, new source node, less than half a kilometer from the eastern ridge tower. Farah frowned. That's not a passive sweep. No, Marin said. It's not. He stepped closer to the display, jaw tightening. If they're recalibrating observation points, they may be cross-referencing behavior against previous telemetry, which could mean, Ari added, they're checking for internal consistency. They're not just watching, they're testing the story. Tomas rubbed a hand across the back of his neck. So, if we screw up the narrative, they might figure out we've known all along, Farah finished. The silence that followed wasn't tense this time. It was thoughtful. Marin stared at the data a long moment, then stepped back. All right, let's keep to the plan. Fray the pattern, shift the tone, but no sudden big moves. He looked at each of them in turn, his voice calm, firm. We stay open, thoughtful, present. If they are finally ready to talk, I want us to sound like people worth listening to. Trellin Voss had not intended to cross the line. At least, that's what he told himself as he hiked beneath the gnarled canopy, each branch dripping with early morning condensation, each step softened by loam and fallen needles. His boots, tuned for station floors, sank unevenly into the moss-covered terrain. His breath came sharp in the cooler air, filtered through a rebreather mask calibrated for atmospheric particulates. The uplink beacon at the forest ridge still blinked faintly in the distance, trailing its invisible tether back to the Serathal array. Behind him, far overhead, the orbital satellites drifted through their long, patient arcs. Somewhere in their memory banks, this movement, his movement, was already being logged as a violation. He moved anyway. The Xenos had known. He was sure of it now. The ritual patterns were too stable, the noise disruptions too perfectly calibrated. Their cultural entropy was strategic, neither ascendant nor decaying, not evolving, not failing, stalling. And that meant one of only two things that he could think of. Either they feared what lay beyond their sky, or they feared him. Or was it something more sinister than either of those things? He reached the edge of the perimeter fence by midday, marked only by a low ridge of mineral-coated pylons and a visual disruption field calibrated to discourage casual approach from local wildlife. Beyond the distortion shimmer, K-281 came into view. Sunlight on solar arrays, pale smoke from chimneys, the faint clatter of tools in use. It was not a primitive village. It was not even pre-industrial. The vehicles parked near the hydro station were quiet, functional. The power lines were redundant, reinforced. Everything about the colony felt restrained. Not incapable, controlled. Trellin stepped across the field, flinching as the boundary line passed over him. It felt like walking through a skin of static. No alarm sounded. No drones appeared. But he knew the moment he was seen. From the nearest rooftop, a motion. On the ground, a figure stepped into full view, calm and unhurried. A woman in a weathered coat, a tool belt slung low on one side, a tablet in her hand. She didn't raise it in warning. She didn't call out. She just watched him approach. Trellin paused, his translator shifting subtly to pick up atmospheric pressure changes and vocal harmonics. He raised his hands, slowly, palms outward. "I am Trellin Voss of the Elyri Sarathal Array," he said, the translator forming the words in a carefully neutral cadence and tone, built from the thousands of recorded hours of the cluster's inhabitants. "I have come to speak." Another pause. Then the woman tilted her head. "Yeah," she said. "We figured someone would eventually." A few more steps brought him into the edge of the settlement proper. The woman was joined by another Xeno, a tall male with a lined face and sharp eyes. He looked Trellin over without comment. Then, without preamble, he turned and walked toward one of the larger structures, nodding for Trellin to follow. Trellin hesitated. His heart was racing now. Perhaps it was a trap. Nothing here was as it seemed. Still, he followed. The building they entered had no door, just a thick hanging sheet of fiber composite. Inside, a modest meeting room. Tables, chairs, a display unit. Simple, utilitarian, clean. And waiting inside, 4 more Xenos. He recognized some of them, names matched from observation files. Marin Callis, Farah Benton, Ari Mendoza. Trellin stood quietly at the center, unsure if he had breached a masquerade or stepped into something older, deeper, and far more prepared. Then Marin spoke. "You came down," he said evenly. "That's new." Trellin's eyes narrowed. "You were waiting." Farah gave a non-committal shrug. "Waiting, watching. Hard to tell the difference from ground level." Ari nodded. "We weren't sure if you'd ever break the pattern, but we figured someone might." Trellin stood very still. The room was quiet. No murmurs of surprise, no shift in posture, no ripple of alarm. Just 4 Xenos looking back at him with a kind of composed inevitability. "I've breached my mandate coming here," he said. "This isn't sanctioned. The others still believe you're what you seem, isolated, undeveloped, benign." "And you don't," Marin said. "I don't," Trellin confirmed. "You've flattened your technological curve, rotated your labor, regulated your growth. It's not stagnation. It's intent." Ari met his gaze. "We weren't trying to deceive anyone, just not startle you." "You must know what happens when civilizations meet each other too soon," Marin said. "Too unevenly. I suspect neither of us would be the first to make that mistake. We didn't want to be the next." He paused and then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit," he said. "You've taken a risk coming down here, so let's talk." Trellin hesitated, then slowly sank into the offered chair. "I have questions," he said. "Good," Marin replied. "We've had answers waiting." The silence that followed was sharper now, not adversarial, but charged with the weight of 2 species finally seeing one another without illusion. Trellin Voss had never expected to sit this close to one of the Xenos. Not in the same room, not breathing the same unfiltered air, not with the veil of passive surveillance removed. They were warmer than he expected, not just in temperature, but in presence. They watched him, yes, but not as if he were dangerous, not as a specimen. They watched him as if they were tired. Tired of waiting, tired of pretending, tired of knowing something no one believed they knew. He studied their meeting chamber. It wasn't the space he expected. No symbols of hierarchy, no formal trappings. Just chairs worn smooth by use, layered data pads, mugs with fading prints. Lived in, unpolished, real. "You've been performing for decades," he said. "You knew we were here before we knew how to interpret your broadcasts. You altered your behaviors to match what we expected of a non-interstellar culture." Farah nodded slowly. "It started with shadows on the telemetry, reflections that didn't match any satellite we launched. We ran diagnostics for weeks before someone asked the real question. What if they aren't ours?" Ari tapped her knuckles lightly on the table. The signal drift came next, polar arc sweeps, low output bursts that repeated just irregularly enough to seem natural. Almost. "We didn't spot them right away," Tomas said. "But once we did, it was obvious. Someone was up there, watching. Not interfering, just collecting." "So, we changed the story," Farah said. "We dimmed the lights, simplified the tech, stayed inside the lines you seemed to want us inside." "And waited," Ari added, voice quiet now. "Not because we were afraid, because we didn't know the rules yet." Trellin stared at them. "You built your civilization to deceive us." "We built it to survive you," Farah said. "At least long enough to figure out what kind of species you were." That silenced him. For a long moment, all that could be heard was the subtle clatter of wind against the outer paneling, the creak of old beams settling. Then Trellin leaned back, brows furrowing. "I thought we were protecting you." Marin studied him, gaze steady. "Maybe you were, but you weren't honest about it. You didn't tell us what rules we were bound by. You didn't offer terms. You just watched." "That's our law. Non-interference. Without consent," Farah cut in. "Without explanation. You don't get to withhold contact and judgment. One of those has to give." Trellin rubbed the bridge of his nose. He felt suddenly aware of every flaw in the system that had trained him, every assumption, every coldly objective field report. "Do others know?" he asked. "Other colonies? Others of your species?" Ari shook her head. "Not this far out. We're alone out here by design. The original mission brief was for a long-duration settlement test, minimal contact, long-term sustainability. The people who sent us might not even remember we exist." Marin stood and walked slowly to the shuttered window, looking out at the distant solar arrays beyond the village edge. "When you first came," he said, "we debated sending a signal, a real one, telling you who we were. But we didn't know if we were dealing with anthropologists or accountants." Trellin tilted his head. "Accountants? People who weigh value by cost," Farah said, "who see disruption as expense, who act to preserve balance sheets, not lives." "And now?" Trellin asked. "Now that I'm here?" Marin turned, hands in his pockets. "Now we finally get to ask something we've been wondering for nearly 20 years. He stepped forward, quietly, and locked eyes with Trellin, then quirked his eyebrow in an expression that Trellin would eventually learn indicated humor. "What took you so long?" We waited beneath the glass, and the silence broke first. Thanks for listening to Dispatches from Seoul. Like, comment, and subscribe before the silence returns.